Late in the evening, the city streets were quiet, and the soft hum of tires on the road filled the silence. The FBI director was behind the wheel of his personal car, something he did only when he wanted peace and time to himself. He had just left his sister's house after a family dinner. Unlike the usual days when black SUVs and security details followed him, tonight he decided to drive alone, without flashing lights, without guards, just a man going home after spending time with his loved ones. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a plain shirt. To anyone passing by, he looked like any other person driving home late at night. The road was dark but calm, lined with street lights that glowed faintly. The director turned up the radio slightly, enjoying the quiet freedom. It was rare for him to be unnoticed, rare to be just another driver on the road. But as he drove, he noticed flashing red and blue lights appear in his rear-view mirror. A police car was signaling him to pull over. He sighed, thinking maybe he had gone a little above the speed limit or that his tail light wasn't working. He calmly steered his car to the side of the road and stopped. The police officer stepped out of the cruiser. His face was hard, his walk firm, and his hand already resting on his holster. The director rolled down his window, ready to hand over his license and registration. "Good evening, officer," he said politely. But the officer didn't greet him back. Instead, he frowned, shining a flashlight straight into the director's eyes. "Step out of the car," the officer barked. The director was taken aback. Usually, officers explain the reason before asking such a thing. Still, he remained calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked in a respectful tone. "I said step out of the car," the officer shouted, this time placing his hand firmly on his gun. The FBI director's heart sank. He had been trained for years to remain calm under pressure, but he never expected to be on the receiving end like this. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, his hands raised to show he had nothing in them. The officer quickly pointed his gun at him. "On your knees," he yelled. The director's mind raced. He tried to explain, speaking firmly but calmly, "Sir, I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I can show you my identification." The officer smirked. "Yeah, right. Everyone says they're important when they get caught. On your knees now." People passing by began to notice what was happening. A couple walking their dog stopped at the corner, staring. A man sitting in his parked car nearby pulled out his phone and began recording. The director, feeling the pressure of the gun inches away, slowly got down on his knees. His heart was steady, but inside, he felt the sting of humiliation. The officer kept yelling, treating him like a dangerous suspect. "Hands behind your head," he ordered. The director obeyed, all while repeating, "You're making a mistake. I am who I say I am. Please check my wallet." But the officer wasn't listening. He seemed fueled by suspicion, by authority he thought he had over someone who looked, at least to him, like just another man on the street at night. The crowd slowly grew. A young woman whispered to her friend, "Wait. I think that's him. Isn't that the FBI guy I saw on the news?" Her friend shook her head at first but then looked closer. "It is, oh my goodness, it really is." The director's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was his security team calling, probably alarmed that his GPS tracker had stopped moving. He knew they would soon realize something was wrong. But in that moment, he was still alone on the pavement, facing the cold barrel of a gun pointed by someone who didn't believe him. Another patrol car pulled up, lights flashing. Two more officers stepped out, curious about what was happening. "What's going on here?" one asked. "I've got a suspicious man here," the first officer replied sharply. "Says he's the FBI director. Can you believe that?" The two new officers laughed lightly, shaking their heads. "People will say anything these days." The director lifted his head, his voice firm. "Call my office." Confirm who I am before this goes further. But no one moved. They kept watching, assuming the first officer was handling it correctly. The bystanders, however, were growing uneasy. A man recording muttered, "This doesn't look right. That's really him. I know it is." He quickly uploaded the video online, tagging local news stations. The air was heavy with tension. The director, kneeling on the rough pavement, felt the weight of the officer's mistrust pressing down on him. He had faced criminals, spies, and international threats, but never had he felt this kind of helplessness at home, on an ordinary street, in front of ordinary people. He wondered how this officer could be so quick to use force, so unwilling to listen, even when given the truth directly. The officer's voice rang out again. "Don't move a muscle, or I'll..." He stopped mid-sentence as the sound of more vehicles filled the air. The director's trained ear recognized it immediately: government SUVs, the kind his own teams used. He realized his detail must have located him. Relief began to wash over him, though his face remained calm. Before the officer could react further, the distant hum of engines grew louder, approaching fast. The bystanders whispered and pulled out more phones. Something big was about to happen, and the scene was far from ordinary now. The director kept still, waiting, knowing that the truth was seconds away from being revealed. In that frozen moment on the roadside, a quiet thought passed through his mind: even the most powerful man in law enforcement could be reduced to a suspect when power was misused. It was a moment of reality, a reminder of how fragile respect could be when fear and authority clashed. And as the flashing lights grew nearer, the story was only just beginning. The cold pavement pressed against his knees, and the FBI director could feel the rough stones digging into his skin. The officer stood tall in front of him, gun still pointed, his voice sharp and commanding. The director stayed calm, reminding himself that panic would only make the situation worse. He had trained agents for years on how to handle tense confrontations, but now he was the one living it. The irony was not lost on him. He was the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the country, yet here he was, treated like a dangerous stranger in the middle of the night. The street had grown louder now. More cars slowed down to watch what was happening, and more people pulled out their phones. Some whispered among themselves, recognizing his face from news broadcasts. But the officer, blinded by authority and suspicion, saw none of it. He walked closer, his hand trembling slightly as he kept the gun aimed at the director. "Keep your eyes down," the officer barked. The director obeyed, but he spoke firmly, trying one more time to explain. "Officer, listen carefully. My name is not just any name. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are making a grave mistake. Look at my identification, it's in my pocket." The officer gave a dry laugh. "You think I was born yesterday? Everyone's a senator, a judge, or a secret agent once they get caught. You're no different. You fit the profile of someone suspicious, and you'll stay right there until I say otherwise." The humiliation stung, but the director kept his dignity. He knew too well that arguing would only fuel the officer's anger. Still, he noticed the bystanders' growing discomfort. A young man holding up his phone said loudly, "That's him. That's the FBI director. Why don't you check his ID?" His words echoed through the quiet street. But the officer only snapped, "Stay out of this. Or I'll arrest you too." The bystanders murmured in shock. Some stepped back in fear, while others grew bolder, whispering to each other that something was very wrong. The director's phone buzzed again in his pocket, but he couldn't reach for it. His security detail must have been tracking him urgently by now. He knew it was only a matter of time before they arrived, but each second felt like an hour. Then, more flashing lights filled the street. Another police car arrived, sirens off but lights spinning red and blue. Two officers stepped out, one younger and unsure, the other older with a face hardened by years on the job. "What's going on here?" the older officer asked, looking at the scene with suspicion. The first officer, still holding the gun, said, "I caught this man acting suspiciously. Claims he's the FBI director." He almost spat the words out, as though mocking them. The older officer raised an eyebrow, glancing at the kneeling man. He paused for a long moment, as if something about the face seemed familiar. But instead of stepping in, he shrugged and said, "If that's what he says, let's confirm it. Why not just check his wallet?" The first officer snapped back, "No need. It's a trick. These guys always lie. He's not going anywhere until I say so." The director took the chance to lift his head. His voice carried authority, calm yet powerful. "Call Washington. Call the bureau right now. They will confirm who I am." The older officer hesitated. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. But the younger officer whispered to him nervously, "Sir, what if he's telling the truth? I've seen his face before." The crowd behind them grew restless. A woman recording said loudly, "You're making fools of yourselves. That's him. This video is going online right now." She pressed her phone screen with determination. The first officer grew angrier, feeling his control slipping away. "Quiet," he shouted at everyone. He turned back to the director. "One more word out of you, and I'll put you flat on the ground." The director took a deep breath. He thought of the years he had spent working to build trust between law enforcement and the public. Now, here was an officer undoing it in minutes, blinded by pride and aggression. Suddenly, the distant hum of engines grew louder. The director recognized it instantly, the unmistakable sound of multiple black SUVs approaching fast. His security detail was close. Relief filled him, though he kept his composure steady. The bystanders turned their heads as the vehicles came into view. Dark tinted windows, government plates, moving with precision. The street lights reflected off their polished surfaces, and the energy shifted. The first officer stiffened, lowering his gun slightly but keeping his guard. "What is this?" he muttered, confusion flickering across his face. The SUVs stopped abruptly, doors swinging open. Men in suits and tactical gear poured out, their movements sharp and disciplined. In seconds, the quiet street was filled with federal agents, their weapons drawn, their voices commanding. "Stand down," one of them shouted. The officer froze, his gun still pointing at the director but his hands beginning to tremble. The crowd gasped, pulling back as the agents formed a protective wall around the kneeling man. One agent rushed forward, helping the director stand. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked respectfully. The director nodded, brushing the dust from his jeans. The agents around him snapped into position, saluting him on the spot. The truth hit the street like a lightning bolt. The bystanders erupted in murmurs, gasps, and shocked exclamations. "It really is him," someone cried. "That officer pulled a gun on the FBI director." The first officer's face drained of color. His hand twitched, and the gun lowered, finally pointing at the ground. I didn't know," he stammered. He didn't look like he didn't, but it was too late. The scene was no longer his to control. Federal agents stepped forward, their eyes locked on him, their voices cold and firm. "You pointed a weapon at the director of the FBI," one agent said flatly. "You're under arrest." The officer stumbled back, shaking his head, still trying to explain. But no words could undo the humiliation. The handcuffs came out, the same ones he had once used on others. The roles were reversed. As the crowd cheered and cameras flashed, the FBI director straightened his shoulders. He looked calm, dignified, though his eyes carried the weight of what had just happened. He glanced at the officer being led away and spoke softly, almost to himself, "No one is above the law." The night air was heavy with silence now, broken only by the clicks of recording phones and the whispers of people who had witnessed a shocking truth, authority misused would always meet accountability. And though the director had been humiliated minutes before, he now stood taller than ever, not just as a man but as a reminder that justice had to be fair for everyone, no matter who they were. The flashing lights painted the entire street in red and blue as the black SUVs stood lined up like sentinels. The neighborhood, once quiet and sleepy, was now wide awake, every window glowing with curious eyes peeking out. People stood on sidewalks, holding their phones high, recording every moment that unfolded in front of them. The man who had been kneeling on the rough pavement just moments ago was no ordinary man. He was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And now, with federal agents surrounding him, the truth was impossible to deny. The officer who had held him at gunpoint looked frozen in place. His hands twitched nervously, and his voice cracked as he muttered, I didn't know. I didn't know who he was." His gun hung loosely by his side now, the confidence he had shown earlier melting into fear. He glanced around at the crowd, at the agents, at the director himself, but there was nowhere left to run, no excuse strong enough to cover what he had just done. The director stood tall, brushing the dust off his knees. He had not shouted, had not raised his voice, even in the worst of the moment. Now, his calm composure made the officer look even smaller in comparison. One of the agents stepped forward, saluting. "Sir, we apologize for arriving late," he said with respect. The director nodded. "You're here now. That's what matters." His voice carried strength, but inside, he could still feel the sting of humiliation, the disbelief that an officer of the law had treated him like a criminal without reason. Yet, his face showed no sign of anger. He knew the eyes of the public were watching, and every word he spoke would carry weight. The officer tried to speak again. He wasn't identifying himself properly, he looked suspicious. "I was just following procedure," but his words were cut short as two agents moved toward him, their faces stern. "You aimed a weapon at the director of the FBI," one of them said coldly. "That's not procedure. That's recklessness." They reached for his wrists, pulling out handcuffs. The officer pulled back slightly, fear spreading across his face. "Wait, no, this isn't fair. I didn't know." The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. The same man who had barked orders moments ago, who had forced another man to kneel, was now the one trembling, surrounded, powerless. The people recording captured every second, knowing the world would soon see it online. The director raised a hand, signaling for calm. His voice was steady, almost gentle, but carried authority. "Take him in," he said simply. "The law will decide his fate." The word sealed the officer's fate. The agents stepped in, pulled his arms behind his back, and clicked the cuffs around his wrists. The metallic sound echoed in the night, a sound that was normally his weapon of power, now turned against him. His eyes darted toward the director, desperate, searching for mercy. But the director only looked at him with quiet disappointment, not hatred. The bystanders erupted in cheers. Some clapped, some shouted, "Justice!" Others shook their heads in disbelief at the entire scene they had witnessed. A young woman holding her phone said to her friend, "This is history right here. Can you believe it?" He tried to humiliate the FBI director and look at him now. Meanwhile, the news was spreading faster than anyone could imagine. The video had already hit social media, and newsrooms across the country were scrambling to cover the story. Anchors were announcing breaking news: local officer detains man at gunpoint, turns out to be the FBI director. Federal agents arrive on scene. Within minutes, millions were watching the shocking footage. The director, still calm, walked toward one of the SUVs. His agents opened the door for him, but before stepping in, he turned to address the crowd. His voice was clear, reaching everyone around him. "Thank you for standing witness tonight. The truth matters, and it always comes to light." His words settled over the people like a weight, reminding them that they had been part of something far greater than a traffic stop. Inside the SUV, the director finally allowed himself a deep breath. The agents glanced at him, waiting for instructions. One asked softly, "Sir, should we take you home, or to headquarters?" The director looked out the tinted window at the flashing lights, the shaken officer now being loaded into a patrol car in cuffs, the crowd still buzzing with energy. He thought about how quickly things had turned, how a moment of abuse of power had nearly become something far worse. "Headquarters," he said firmly. "This isn't just about me. It's about the message this sends." The SUV pulled away, followed by the rest of the convoy. The streets slowly began to clear, but the story was already alive, moving from phone screens to television broadcasts, spreading across the country like wildfire. At FBI headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. Senior officials had already seen the video. When the director entered the room, they rose to their feet, some in shock, some in anger on his behalf. One of his deputies said, "Sir, we've never seen anything like this. The whole nation is watching." The director adjusted his jacket, still dusty from the pavement. "Then we give them the truth," he replied. "No cover UPS. No excuses. This officer must be held accountable, not because of who I am, but because of what he did. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." Those words hit the room like a spark. Everyone nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. It was no longer just about a single officer's mistake, it was about showing the country that accountability was not selective. Back in the small town, the arrested officer sat in the back of a patrol car, his head hung low. He could hear the shouts of the crowd outside, the very same crowd that had once watched him command the scene. Now they were pointing, whispering, recording his downfall. His career, his reputation, his freedom, it all felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The irony was cruel. He had wanted to show power, to assert control. Instead, he had exposed himself in front of the entire nation. And soon, the doors of the justice system would close around him, just as he had closed them around so many others before. That night, the FBI director sat in his office long after midnight, reflecting on everything that had happened. The humiliation was still fresh, but stronger than that was his determination to use the moment as a lesson. He knew the story would dominate headlines for weeks. He knew debates would rage across television screens and dinner tables. But he also knew it was an opportunity to remind everyone, from ordinary citizens to those in uniform, that no one was above the law. The night had begun with flashing lights on a lonely road. It ended with the nation's top lawman standing taller than ever, his dignity intact, his words echoing, "The truth always comes to light." And though the world was still buzzing with the shock of what they had seen, the director had already begun to shape the meaning of it all. The morning sun rose slowly over the city, casting a soft golden glow over the streets that had only hours before been filled with flashing lights and sirens. But now, in the quiet of dawn, the weight of the previous night still lingered in the air. At the FBI headquarters, the hallways were already alive with activity. Agents and staff moved with purpose, some whispering to each other, others reviewing security footage from the incident. The story had not faded, in fact, it had grown larger with each passing hour. News channels ran continuous updates, and social media feeds were flooded with clips, opinions, and endless speculation. Inside the director's office, the atmosphere was calm but focused. He stood by the large window, looking down at the streets below, watching the city wake up. Even in this moment of reflection, he remained sharp and precise, aware that the ripple effects of last night's events would touch countless lives. He knew that while the officer who had pulled him over faced immediate consequences, the real work was just beginning. Accountability was not just about punishment, it was about learning, reforming, and ensuring that something like this could never happen again. His assistant knocked gently and entered, holding a tablet loaded with the latest updates. "Sir," she said, "the officer has been officially suspended, and there's already a preliminary investigation underway. The local police department is cooperating fully. Also, the media is requesting statements. They want your perspective before noon." The director nodded, accepting the tablet but keeping his gaze outside the window. "Good," he said. "Prepare a statement, but make sure it emphasizes accountability and safety for everyone. This isn't about me, it's about trust in the system. I want it clear that respect and proper procedure are not optional, especially for those in uniform." Meanwhile, the officer who had pulled him over was being processed at the local precinct. Sitting in a small, stark holding room, he struggled to comprehend the turn of events. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on him. Photos of his arrest had gone viral, and even his colleagues were now distant, some avoiding him altogether. He could feel the walls closing in. Every decision he had made that night, every misjudgment, every rush of adrenaline, had been magnified and dissected by the world. Back at headquarters, the director's team began reviewing the footage carefully. The goal was not just to recount the event but to analyze it, to understand how such a situation could have escalated and what measures could be put in place to prevent future incidents. They studied the officer's approach, his body language, his commands, and the environment of the scene. It became clear that the incident had been fueled by assumptions, fear, and a lack of communication. The director made notes, emphasizing the importance of training, awareness, and empathy in high-stress situations. Later, the director met with the city's police chief in a formal conference room. The chief was tense, aware of the magnitude of what had happened and the public outrage that followed. "We understand the gravity of this," he said, his voice measured. "We're taking steps to review protocols, retrain our officers, and ensure this never happens again. The officer involved has been suspended, pending full review." The director listened carefully, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "I appreciate that," he replied. "But actions speak louder than words. I want to see real change, not just statements. The people must trust that law enforcement can act with professionalism, integrity, and fairness. One mistake of this scale can erode public confidence for years. We need to repair that trust immediately." Across the city, news outlets continued to broadcast the story. Analysts debated what it meant for policing, for public safety, and for accountability at high levels of government. Pundits speculated on the reactions of citizens, officers, and political figures alike. The public, meanwhile, was divided. Some praised the director's composure, some criticized the officer's actions, and many simply marveled at the surreal nature of the incident, a man holding the highest office in law enforcement being treated as a suspect in his own country. In his office, the director prepared to make a public statement. He read the words carefully, emphasizing clarity, humility, and authority. He spoke directly to the people, acknowledging the fear and tension that officers face, but reminding everyone that no one is above the law and that professional conduct is essential. He addressed the officer's arrest calmly, explaining that the purpose was not vengeance but justice and accountability. His tone was firm but fair, commanding respect not through anger but through presence. The statement was released across multiple platforms. In minutes, it had millions of views. Social media exploded with reactions, news channels replayed the footage, and newspapers prepared their morning editions with headlines describing the extraordinary event. Many citizens felt vindicated, others reassured, and some reflective, thinking about how assumptions, power, and responsibility intersected in their own lives. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, the officer sat in quiet despair. He had begun to understand that the chain of decisions he had made out of fear, uncertainty, or misjudgment had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. This was no longer just a disciplinary issue. His reputation, his career, and his personal sense of pride had been shaken. And the realization that the entire nation was watching only intensified the weight of the moment. As the day went on, the director returned to his office to brief senior FBI officials. They discussed the implications of the incident, the need for training programs, the importance of interagency communication, and the role of public trust in effective law enforcement. Plans were made to host workshops, to work closely with local departments, and to create educational campaigns about recognizing authority, procedure, and proper protocol. The director's vision was clear: a single incident, though shocking, could become a catalyst for widespread improvement in the system. The public, meanwhile, continued to follow every update. News anchors highlighted the director's statements, showing clips of him speaking calmly in front of cameras, emphasizing fairness, safety, and accountability. Editorials praised his leadership and composure under stress. Citizens commented on social media, discussing the implications for law enforcement training and public trust. In many ways, the incident had sparked a national conversation about professionalism, power, and responsibility in moments of high tension. Even as the attention grew, the director remained grounded. He knew the media storm would fade, but the lessons from that night could last a lifetime if handled correctly. He began drafting a report on the incident, carefully noting recommendations for law enforcement agencies nationwide. Each point was deliberate, focusing on prevention, training, communication, and ethical behavior. The goal was not punishment for punishment's sake but reform to ensure no one else experienced what he had endured. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the city began to quiet once more. Yet the story was far from over. The officer faced formal charges, a trial was imminent, and the public's scrutiny was unwavering. But more importantly, the director had turned a moment of personal danger into an opportunity for leadership, for reform, and for setting an example that stretched far beyond the city streets where the incident had occurred. He leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the strange chain of events that had led him from a moment of fear on a roadside to this moment of strategic planning and leadership. The incident had tested his patience, his composure, and his commitment to the principles of justice. And though the officer's actions had been reckless, the director's response had reinforced the values that the nation expected from its leaders: calm under pressure, fairness in judgment, and a vision for a better, safer, and more accountable future. By the time night fell, the city had absorbed the shock, the country had absorbed the story, and the FBI had begun the process of reform and reflection. The director's presence remained a symbol of integrity and authority, a reminder that even in moments of chaos, leadership and justice could prevail. And somewhere in the city, the officer sat quietly, a stark contrast to the man he had confronted, realizing that actions have consequences, and accountability is unavoidable. The following morning brought a different energy to the city. The streets were calmer than the previous day, but the memory of what had happened was still fresh in everyone's mind. People walked past the police stations and newsstands, glancing at headlines that seemed almost surreal. A top federal officer had been held at gunpoint by a local police officer, and the situation had been caught on camera for the world to see. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading beyond the borders of the city to national and even international news outlets. Inside the FBI headquarters, the director began his day early. His schedule was packed with meetings, briefings, and interviews. Yet, amidst all the activity, he remained composed and deliberate. He knew that every word he spoke, every decision he made, would be scrutinized by the public and by the law enforcement community. Today was not about personal vindication, it was about creating positive outcomes from a dangerous incident. His first meeting of the day was with the Internal Review Board. They had gathered to discuss the officer who had pulled him over, the procedures that were followed or not followed, and the steps that needed to be taken to ensure accountability. Evidence, including video footage, witness statements, and body cam recordings, was carefully analyzed. Each detail was dissected to understand how the situation escalated to the point where a gun was drawn unnecessarily. The director listened closely, asking pointed questions and noting inconsistencies. He emphasized the importance of recognizing human error without overlooking responsibility. "This is not about punishing someone out of anger," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It is about ensuring that mistakes like this are not repeated and that the public can have confidence in every officer on duty. Lives are at stake when proper protocol is ignored." Meanwhile, the officer who had caused the incident was taken to court for the first hearing. Sitting in the courtroom, he felt the weight of the law pressing down on him. He was no longer a police officer acting on instinct, he was a defendant under the gaze of his peers, the public, and the media. Legal representatives presented the charges, and the seriousness of the situation became undeniable. The courtroom was quiet except for the murmur of observers and the shuffle of papers. This was not just about an individual mistake, it was about trust, safety, and the principles of law enforcement. At the same time, the director continued his outreach. He met with local community leaders, explaining the steps being taken to address the incident and improve policing standards. He emphasized transparency, accountability, and community engagement. Citizens listened attentively, many relieved that the situation was being addressed seriously. Others were emotional, recounting stories of encounters with law enforcement and expressing the hope that real change could come from this highly visible incident. He also took time to speak to law enforcement officers across the city, addressing groups in small meetings, stressing the importance of proper procedure, respect for human life, and the responsibility that comes with carrying a weapon. His message was clear: authority must be exercised with care, judgment, and integrity. Mistakes can cost careers, lives, and public trust, but they also offer an opportunity for learning and growth if handled correctly. Outside the halls of law enforcement, the city was buzzing with discussion. Social media posts analyzed every moment of the encounter, some praising the director's calmness and leadership, others critiquing the officer's training and judgment. Citizens debated online, sharing personal stories and ideas about reform, while news outlets ran detailed analyses of policy, procedure, and officer accountability. The story had sparked a nationwide conversation about safety, respect, and the balance of authority. In his office, the director received updates from his legal team. They outlined the charges, the likely proceedings, and the expectations for the trial. While he was not directly involved in prosecuting the officer, he understood the importance of the process being fair, transparent, and thorough. The goal was not revenge, but justice, a message that was essential for both the public and the law enforcement community. He also coordinated with national law enforcement agencies to discuss new training programs. The goal was to prevent incidents like this from happening anywhere in the country. Topics included recognizing authority, managing high-pressure situations, communication strategies, and de-escalation techniques. He emphasized the importance of building trust, both within the community and among officers themselves. "We must lead by example," he said. "When we act with respect and care, we teach others to do the same." By midday, the director made a public appearance to address the media. Standing in front of the cameras, he spoke with clarity and authority. He acknowledged the fear and tension that can arise in high-stress situations but reinforced that no one is above the law and that proper procedure must always be followed. He praised the quick response of responsible officers and emphasized the importance of ongoing training and accountability. His words were met with widespread approval, calming public concern and inspiring confidence in the measures being implemented. Later that afternoon, the officer faced another hearing, this time to discuss bail and continued suspension. Legal arguments were presented, and the judge emphasized the severity of the incident. The courtroom was full of observers, journalists, and members of the public, all eager to see justice carried out. The officer remained quiet, reflecting on the choices that led to this moment and the consequences that would shape his future. At the FBI headquarters, the director reviewed plans for further community engagement. Programs were being developed to educate citizens on interactions with law enforcement, to teach officers about proper procedures, and to create a culture of accountability and transparency. He believed that incidents like this, while shocking, could serve as catalysts for meaningful reform if addressed thoughtfully and with care. As evening approached, he returned to his office, looking out over the city from the tall windows of headquarters. The streets below were quiet now, bathed in the soft light of sunset. He reflected on the long week, the fear on the roadside, the tense confrontation, the public scrutiny, and the steps being taken to create positive change. It had been a moment of danger and surprise, but it had also been an opportunity, a chance to lead by example, to demonstrate calm under pressure, and to emphasize the importance of justice, fairness, and responsibility. In the days that followed, the officer's case continued to progress through the legal system. The public remained engaged, paying close attention to updates and developments. Meanwhile, the director's initiatives began to take shape, new training programs were implemented, community discussions were held, and officers were provided with resources to improve their understanding of protocol and public interaction. Change was slow, but it was deliberate, and it carried the potential to prevent future incidents. The incident also had an unexpected effect. It reminded everyone of the human element in law enforcement. Officers, citizens, and leaders alike were reminded that fear, stress, and misjudgment could escalate situations quickly. But it also showed the power of calm, experience, and leadership in guiding outcomes toward safety and accountability. As the city moved forward, the director continued his work, balancing the demands of leadership with the responsibility of oversight. He remained accessible to the public, to law enforcement officers, and to his own team, emphasizing that transparency and accountability were ongoing commitments. The story of the roadside incident became a case study, a teaching moment, and a symbol of the need for vigilance, fairness, and integrity in every aspect of law enforcement. In the end, the incident that began as a moment of danger transformed into a broader lesson for the city, the nation, and even the officer involved. It highlighted the importance of procedure, communication, and respect, and it demonstrated how leadership could turn a crisis into an opportunity for meaningful change. The FBI director's composed response, clear vision, and dedication to justice left a lasting impact, inspiring trust and reinforcing the values that define public service. And as the city lights twinkled beneath the darkening sky, there was a quiet sense of hope. Mistakes had been made, accountability had been enforced, and lessons had been learned. The people, the officers, and the leadership had all been reminded that even in moments of fear and confusion, integrity, calm, and responsibility could guide the way forward. The story would be remembered not just for the shock of the roadside encounter, but for the courage, clarity, and commitment to justice that followed.